The Duke of Ashbourne had refused every eligible bride in England, and by the autumn of his 34th year, most of London had simply stopped asking when he would marry. For 10 years, his mother, the Dowager Duchess, had brought a steady parade of suitable young women before him, daughters of earls, heiresses with grand dowries, the most accomplished beauties of every season. He had been polite to every one of them. He had danced with them at balls, taken tea with their families, and complimented their music or their needlework when asked. And then, without fail, he had declined to pursue any of them further. It was not that Edmund Hale disliked women, or that he was cold-hearted, as some of the crueler gossip columns suggested. It was simply that he had never once felt what his father used to describe before he died, a sudden, unmistakable sense that a person belonged in his life. Edmund had begun to wonder if his father had simply been a romantic old man telling stories, and that no such feeling truly existed. He had nearly given up looking for it. That autumn, business called him away from London. A bridge on one of his smaller estates, in a quiet corner of Hampshire called Wren's Hollow, had been damaged badly in the spring floods, and the repairs needed his personal attention. Wren's Hollow was not a place dukes usually visited. It was small and plain, full of farmers, shopkeepers, and modest cottages, without a single grand house worth mentioning. Edmund expected to spend 2 weeks there at most, approve the engineer's plans, and return to London before the weather turned cold. He did not expect to see her on his second day in the village. She was standing outside the small stone schoolhouse, surrounded by a cluster of children, gently correcting a boy's posture as he struggled to read aloud from a worn primer. She wore a plain gray dress with no lace or ornament, her dark hair pinned back simply, without any of the elaborate styling Edmund was used to seeing in London drawing rooms. There was something unhurried about the way she moved, as though she had never once thought of herself as important enough to rush. Edmund, riding past on his way to inspect the bridge, slowed his horse without quite deciding to. He did not stop. There was no reason to. He was a duke come to inspect a bridge, and she was clearly the village schoolteacher, a woman with no fortune and no name worth mentioning in society. He told himself, quite firmly, that he had no cause to think of her again. He failed completely. The repairs to the bridge took longer than expected. 2 weeks became 3. Edmund found that he did not mind the delay nearly as much as he should have. He began taking his morning rides along the lane that passed the schoolhouse, telling himself the route was simply more pleasant than the alternative, though he privately knew this was not entirely true. On the 9th day, a sudden rainstorm broke over the village, just as the school children were let out for their midday break. Edmund, riding past, saw the schoolteacher trying to herd a dozen wet, giggling children back indoors, holding an umbrella far too small to do any good. Her shoulders were already soaked through. Without quite deciding to, he dismounted, walked over, and offered her his greatcoat. She looked up at him with plain surprise. It was not the fluttering, practiced surprise he was used to from young ladies in London, who always seemed to know exactly how to react to a duke's attention. This was a simple, searching look, as if she were honestly trying to work out why a duke had stopped his horse to hand her a coat in the middle of a rainstorm. "That's very kind, Your Grace," she said, "but I couldn't possibly take your coat. You'll catch a chill," he said. "The children need their teacher well, I imagine, more than I need to stay dry on a short ride home." She hesitated, glanced at the children now huddled and shivering by the schoolhouse door, and finally accepted the coat, mostly, he suspected, to end the conversation before her pupils caught further cold. She thanked him properly, told him her name was Margaret Coyle, and disappeared inside with her students before he could say anything else. That was the beginning of it, though neither of them would have called it that at the time. Edmund found reasons to return to the schoolhouse over the following weeks. He told himself each visit was purely practical. He brought a crate of books for the children, claiming the estate had no other use for them. He inquired about the state of the schoolhouse roof, which did, admittedly, need some repair. He asked whether the parish required more coal for the coming winter. Each excuse was reasonable enough on its own, but taken together, even Edmund could no longer pretend they meant nothing. Margaret treated him, through all of this, with the same plain honesty she seemed to extend to everyone, whether duke or delivery boy. She did not fuss over his title, or try to impress him with flattering words. When he made a comment she thought was foolish, she told him so directly, though always kindly, and Edmund found this almost shocking. In London, he had spent a decade surrounded by people too careful of his rank to ever truly disagree with him. Margaret simply said what she thought, and somehow, that honesty felt more valuable to him than every compliment he had ever received in a ballroom. Slowly, in pieces, he learned the shape of her life. Her father had been the village curate, a man of more learning than money, who had taught her Latin and arithmetic alongside her prayers before he died and left her to support herself. She had taken the post of village schoolteacher 6 years earlier, and had never once complained about it, though Edmund suspected the hours were long and the pay was thin. She loved her pupils fiercely, in a way that had nothing performed about it. She read every book she could borrow from the local vicar's small library. She had never once, in her 27 years, traveled further than the nearest county town. By the time November arrived, Edmund understood that he had fallen in love with her. The realization troubled him deeply, because he understood exactly what it would cost her if he acted on it. A duke could not simply marry a village schoolteacher without consequence. He knew precisely what society would say. They would claim she had trapped him somehow, that she was far beneath his station, that she would be mocked in every fine drawing room from London to Bath for daring to wear his family's name. He thought of his mother's certain disapproval, and of the cold treatment Margaret would likely face from people who had never worked an honest day in their lives, but would still feel entitled to judge the cut of her dress, or the plainness of her speech. More than once, he very nearly left Wren's Hollow without telling her anything at all, convincing himself that silence would spare her the difficulty his attention would surely bring. It was Margaret, in the end, who forced the matter, though entirely without meaning to. He came to call on her one cold December afternoon, and found her sitting at her small desk in tears, a letter open before her. The parish council, citing hard times, had voted to cut the school's already small funding. She did not know how she would keep the schoolhouse running through the winter, let alone afford new slates and primers come spring. She had not expected him to call, and she was clearly embarrassed to be found crying. She was not asking him for help. She had not even known he was coming, but watching her there, trying so hard to hold herself together over children who were not even her own by blood, Edmund understood that he had been a coward to consider leaving without telling her the truth. "Miss Coyle," he said, "I have something I must say to you, and I find I can no longer put it off." She wiped her eyes quickly and looked up at him, startled by the seriousness in his voice. He told her plainly that he loved her. He said he had loved her for weeks, without admitting it even to himself, and that he understood completely if she wanted nothing to do with the complications his attention would bring, the gossip, the scrutiny, the families who might never quite accept her as his wife. He told her the school would be funded, regardless of her answer, because the children deserved it, whether or not she ever wished to see him again. Margaret did not answer right away. She studied him carefully, as though weighing something important. "Do you understand what you are asking of yourself?" she said finally. "You would be the duke who married a schoolteacher with no fortune, no family name worth mentioning, and dirt on the hem of her dress more often than not. Have you truly thought about what that would mean for you, or is this simply the passing fancy of a bored nobleman with a broken bridge and too much time on his hands?" It was not a question asked out of false modesty. She genuinely wanted to know whether he had reckoned with it, or whether this was merely a temporary distraction that would fade once he returned to London. Edmund did not look away from her. "I have thought of little else for weeks," he said. "And I have refused every eligible woman in England for 10 years, Miss Coyle, because not one of them ever asked me a question half as difficult as that one." For a long moment, Margaret said nothing at all. Then slowly, something in her expression softened, and she allowed herself, perhaps for the first time since he had met her, to look hopeful rather than merely steady. "Then perhaps," she said quietly, "you had better stay a while longer in Wren's Hollow, Your Grace, and we shall see." He did stay, and by the time the first snow fell over the village, there was no question left between them of staying or leaving. There was only the matter of when. They were married the following spring, not in some grand London cathedral, but in the small stone church at Wren's Hollow, where Margaret had been christened, and where she had taught nearly every child, now scattering flower petals along the path before her. The village turned out in its best clothes, proud and a little disbelieving that their plain, hard-working schoolteacher had somehow won the heart of a duke who had refused every fine lady in England. The Dowager Duchess, predictably, was horrified when she first learned of the engagement. She arrived from London with a long list of objections and a colder manner than usual, fully prepared to talk her son out of what she considered a terrible mistake. But Margaret, who had never once been intimidated by anyone of high rank, met her with the same calm honesty she gave everyone else. She did not grovel or apologize for who she was. She simply answered every sharp question plainly and without flinching, until even the Dowager Duchess, against her own expectations, found herself somewhat won over by the young woman's quiet steadiness. It helped, too, that Edmund's devotion to Margaret was so evidently real that even his mother could not pretend otherwise for long. London society, as Edmund had predicted, gossiped viciously for a season. There were cruel remarks at parties, pointed looks in ballrooms, and more than one unkind word printed in the papers about a duke who had married beneath his station. Margaret bore it with the same steady patience she had always shown her students, never rising to the bait, never pretending to be something she was not. Slowly, as it always does, the gossip faded, helped along by the plain fact that the Duke of Ashbourne was unmistakably, inconveniently happy, and that his new duchess showed no sign of disappearing quietly into irrelevance, no matter how many fine ladies whispered behind their fans. In the years that followed, Margaret used her new position to do what she had always wanted to do, only on a far larger scale. She funded schools across half a dozen of the Ashbourne family's estates, insisting that no farmer's child or tenant's daughter should grow up as close to the edge of hardship as she once had. She visited each school personally whenever she could, often arriving without warning, much to the surprise of local teachers who had not expected a duchess to sit down on a low bench and listen to a child stumble through a reading lesson. She never lost the habit of correcting people's posture when they read aloud, even at the Duke's own dinner table, much to the amusement of guests who quickly learned that the Duchess of Ashbourne cared rather more for clear speech and good grammar than for fine manners alone. Edmund, for his part, never tired of telling the story to anyone who would listen. He would say, with evident pride, that he had spent 10 years searching every ballroom in London for a wife, only to find her at last in a small Hampshire schoolyard, soaked through by the rain, holding an umbrella far too small for the job, and entirely unimpressed by his title. It became, in time, one of the most well-loved stories among the Ashbourne tenants and servants alike, not because it involved a duke, though that certainly made it more interesting to repeat, but because it proved something the villagers of Wren's Hollow had always believed in their hearts, that kindness and honesty, however plain their dress, would always be worth more in the end than fortune or fine breeding, and that sometimes, The right person had been waiting all along, not in a grand London drawing room, but in a small stone schoolhouse, teaching children to read.